The go-to breakfast. Huh? What was your go-to breakfast? Back then, it's not very nutritional. It's not very nutritional.
Egg, bread. What's wrong with that?
I mean, it's not bad.
All right.
But yeah, you could.
So here we go. So let's talk a little bit about. I didn't put it up there.
Should we tell them there?
Yeah, French toast was every morning. Okay.
Oh, it's
I'm a
actually.
waffles guy.
You think waffles are not?
No, I'm not one to talk.
All right. How do they make these casts? What do they do?
They just got them out.
They weren't like that. No, I told you guys that on Friday.
Plaster.
Yes. They're like a hollow, maybe a few bones in there. They filled up with plaster and came up with that. Those Pompeii, if you can stomach tourists, but there's a lot of them. Yeah.
The only reason I went to Pompeii was fun.
That's what the only reason you went?
Yeah, it was like things to see, but
You went to see the bodies? That's a little dark.
All right,
Let's get to a couple more emperors very quickly.
Yeah.
We're not going to go through every emperor, but one that's considered like the philosopher of, and remember Stoic, this idea of giving back in public service. Marcus Aurelius, and Marcus Aurelius, and he also expanded into Germany, what is now Germany, tried to expand into Dacia. His idea was to expand the empire partially for some kind of an outlet for soldiers, but he wanted to return to some kind of republic. And we don't know how he died. He was already very old, but he died after campaigning in Germany. If you watch the movie Gladiator, which is 17 hours long, they try to make it like his son killed him, which very well could have.
Is it really that long?
Huh?
Is the movie really that long?
Hyperbole is fun.
I was to say, why do you think it's
But it's like 3.5 hours, isn't it, I think?
Yeah, it's long.
A lot of people didn't like the movie.
I think partially it is very long and you can get tedious. A lot of people love it.
Yeah.
Pax Romana would end, at least arguably after that. Yes, there'd be still Rome and Roman control, but this is the beginning of barbarian invasions, and the end is coming, which we'll get to more on Wednesday. And he'd be replaced by a son Commodus, who would be who would be one of the most cruel of all the emperors, and he'd be murdered by his Praetorian Guard. Gee, there's a trend here. And you can see a 100-year decline in Rome after that. And this decline, we're not going to go all the details of this, but Diocletian would arguably help end this. They call it actually, if you're into Roman history, when I was in college, I took 2 classes on Roman history. One was fantastic, one moving on, but wow, was that a bad one. He was a great teacher, knew his stuff, that was a lot of fun, but he talked a lot about the crisis of the 3rd century. And this was relatively weak emperors, barbarian invasion, and even though the economic system was surviving, there was a lot of inflation. Prices were going up, and if prices go up and you don't have any money, that could be a massive crisis. Or if you have money and prices go up. Think about, let's say you have all this fortune buried in your backyard, and there's inflation. What happens to the value of that fortune?
It goes down.
It goes down. And that's what was happening, this general insecurity. Now, inflation, a little bit of inflation can be very, very good for the economy. It encourages people to make more investment because the idea is, hey, prices will be up tomorrow, I can make more money. And the idea of more wages will come in, you can pay back your debts easier. But this really destabilized Rome because it just meant that the entire financial system was devalued. And Diocletian, another general, would end the crisis in a way, end is the wrong word, would put it off, kick a can down the road. he ruled with an iron fist. He was very, very much involved in almost all the activities. He kept people, okay, they fixed my oil. Yeah. Well, the problem is, he said, the thermostat isn't working very well. So I'm used to that. And of course, it's still relatively stable here, but it's still, you can start to see maybe not as high quality, but he took away almost all personal liberties. He was going to take iron control, including persecution of, for example, Christians. His administration, though, he streamlined it. Streamlined tax collection, streamlined the military. Now, in the long run, his reforms in the military is going to help lead to the end of Rome. The reliance upon non-Roman auxiliaries and heavy cavalry. Armored cavalry, they met again in Iraq, and they just blew them away. And we'll come back to the armored cavalry when we get to medieval Europe. And we will do jousting in the hallway. So yeah, running full speed at each other, last one passes. The amazing thing is, there are a few people who are like, God, I wish that was true. But the rest of it, okay, with that. And the bureaucracy, now bureaucracy is a term for government employees. And what they did is, he went outside the norms of bureaucracy. Now, normally, this would be a way to give your brothers and friends a job. What do you call that when you give your family members or close friends a job? Begins with an M. Anyone know? Let's get this word. It's a great word to know.
Xmas.
No. It's called nepotism. All right. And that's giving friends or relatives a job, and this is always a sure sign of corruption.
Get someone who will fucking walk past the hall.
Is it rolling all the way down?
This is just rolling down the hall. Up the stairs, out the building.
Oh, yeah, that's
Didn't make it into Mr. Larson's room. But how hard did you throw it? Huh? I don't know my own. So nepotism is giving government jobs, and he tried to make it more efficient, but it's going to be a problem in every. You see this in every empire. You can see it in the United States too. And he also divided the empire into two realms, the East and the West, with the idea being it's much more difficult. It was so difficult to administer it all from Rome, even with the great roads and the network, and then eventually two more. He would divide up into 4 districts. But this would be the beginning of the split of Rome. Yes, there'll be one more civil war. It'll be unified again for a very short period, and then the Eastern Roman Empire. The Western Roman Empire would officially die in 476, which we'll get to. The Eastern Roman Empire didn't die until 1453, with the fall of Constantinople. But that's another story for down the road. And we got the Western and Eastern, and more, the Eastern will be called the Byzantine. Okay, today. By 1700s, 1800s, they started calling it Byzantine. They called themselves Romans all the way to the end. Even when they all spoke Greek, they still called themselves Roman.
No, that's the idea.
Right here, at this crossroads, you can imagine what an important spot this would be. For today, it's modern-day Istanbul. There's a tiny little Greek town called Byzantium. It was just nothing more than like basically a pier. And that's why they call it the Byzantine Empire. We call it that today. So Diocletian he will establish this double empire, but then after he died, you can imagine once you get rid of the absolute ruler, then everybody wants to try to take over. We're going to jump right to here. While this is going on, we got to go back to Judea. We talked about Judea before, and a little bit about the growth of Judaism. And remember, they were captured by Babylonians and allowed back by Cyrus. And then, do you remember the Roman leader pre-empire who would take over Judea for the Romans? And his head would be given to Caesar, and he was very mad. Yeah, Pompey. That's Pompey. I'll say Pompey, but that's in the
That's a place.
Pompey's pillar. Not, it's different Pompey. Yeah. Judea was what we call the procurator, which was basically a state or province within the Roman Empire. It had a leader, a president, or I'm sorry, not president, jeez, essentially a viceroy. And they basically allowed Judaism to exist there. As long as they pay taxes, Romans don't care. Oh, you had to make offerings to the Roman gods. Offerings to the Roman gods. The Pharisees were the Jewish leaders in Rome, in these Roman provinces. They ran it. They weren't quite collaborators, but they essentially were, they benefited a little bit from the Roman rule. They accepted it. And the Romans allowed them to run Judea for the most part, as long as they paid taxes, and if there ever was a decree from Rome, they followed it. But more and more, there were religious leaders who wanted to break away from the Romans. But you have the weird thing, the Romans built aqueducts and roads, some modern plumbing in various cities in Judea, especially Jerusalem, which sure, they appreciated that, but at the same time, the Romans had very cruel taxation and no real freedom outside of what the Romans would allow. And the Zealots had this very much a view of people in this region of the world. So if you look at that area of the old Ottoman Empire, the Arab world, Egyptian world, here outside the desert, the people who live there are called Semites. It's just a generic term for those who live there, Semites. And so today, Arabs are Semites, Jews are Semites. Semites. And there was a very fatalistic view there that, especially partially because I imagine the very difficult life there, is that they're very fatalistic. And the idea being that almost to the point of the end is near, we have no choice, the world is being decided for us. And so there's always looking for somebody to lead us out of this almost doom that's coming. And some of these insecurities would be all the economic issues of Roman rule, the high taxation. Also, some people got involved in the trade, got richer. They're very clear about it. There's some money being made here. Then the society changing so rapidly because of Roman rule. Also, a few other things. Every religion changes over time because of Roman influence. Judaism had changed. And you have people who are saying, okay, we can maintain our religion within the Roman Empire, and some say we're going to have to break away, like the Zealots. And those people are breaking away. We're saying we need salvation from the Romans. And they look for someone to lead them, lead to the right one, a Messiah. And I mentioned this before, there were over 100 people that would be followed as a Messiah in this era. And somebody who might be a very active member of the church, a former Pharisee, some might be literally somebody who was born impoverished and living out in the wilderness. And they were followed, with the idea being somebody will lead us out of this. And you'll see this time after time in history. In AP US history, we were just talking about a time period called, in my class, this year. And some of you had that class last year. I know remember something called the Second Great Awakening. And the same kind of thing. And there were these people called the Millerites who thought the end of the world was coming. They all went on their roofs on April 12th, 1844, and waited for the end. And the thought was they would be taken off their roof to salvation, and everybody else would die in a fiery hell. By the way, I don't know if you know this, but it didn't happen. And they called it the Great Disappointment. It was so sad they were destroyed. You have see this at times of great insecurity. What was great insecurity then? The Industrial Revolution. It was the Industrial Revolution. And people get scared and they want something to tell them, okay, we'll help you out, or we will provide you security. You saw the same thing here with the insecurities at this time. And a lot of this would blow up in 66 with the Jewish revolt, which we have mentioned before in class. And so this is the revolt that happened during Vespasian. In fact, his son Titus would put it down. Jerusalem rose up. They murdered many of the Romans, or those who collaborated with the Romans, many of the Pharisees. And they declared independence in Jerusalem. Jerusalem was besieged, and the Romans, this siege would last over a year. The Romans don't give up. At least the old Rome, pre-Diocletian. They don't quit. And Jerusalem would be sacked and destroyed. And this statue is supposed to show the remnants from the temple that was destroyed being led away to the first of the diasporas. There'd be another Jewish revolt, which we mentioned before. Oh, almost forgot. Some of the most radical zealots would go to this fortified hilltop called Masada. And at Masada, there'd be a 1.5-year siege where they have this beautiful mountain valley. By the way, I got a message back about the mountain valley. You want to hear the message?
More mountain valley.
Good point. We didn't know we did that. Well, I just want to give I want a different. How about a different mountain valley?
Yeah.
There's some desert valley off in the Middle East. Just pick that one.
Last year we had me for class. It was Paul McCartney. So this mountaintop, and the Romans surrounded it under Titus, besieged it, and then to get to the top where this fortified hill was, you see this right here? Supposedly they made this. Thousands of people, Roman soldiers and slaves, built this ramp up so they could get to the top of this. Remember what I said they don't quit? They don't quit. They spent months making this ramp so they could bring their siege engines. Here's one of their big siege engines up to the wall to knock down the fortified town of Masada and take them all prisoner. Now what happened was, those people inside, before they knew they were all going to be crucified. And so they committed suicide before the Romans started. But Masada, okay, some of these were zealots who were, there was a lot of anger amongst Jews about what they did, causing the Romans to destroy Jerusalem. But when Israel became a state, this became kind of almost a memorialized place. So very much within the mythology of modern Israel. But in 32-36, the Barcode Revolt, I mentioned this once before. The only reason I mentioned it here is that the temple was destroyed, and that's where the final diaspora. And the reason I'm mentioning this to you is because I'm trying to give you an idea about the instability within Judea and amongst Jews there. And it would make sense that would be one Messiah, person who was called by some a Messiah. His death would actually lead to a religion that would sweep out of Judea and really become a Greek religion and then spread throughout the world. And that person's name was Josiah, who in Greek is Jesus. It's very much a Greek religion. It's really interesting how that happens. But it starts here. It's just weird how stuff happens. And then spreads. And it's different than Judaism, but he was a Jewish man. We know bits and pieces. The reason why we know bits and pieces, there's only a couple Roman references. And then there's going to be 4 stories written about him, but they have some conflicting stories, and the 4 are going to be called the Gospels. And there's lots of reasons for that. You have different people writing stories at different time over the next 130 years after his life. So we're going to just tell you a few of the basics about him. But this is a mosaic from the Byzantine Empire at about 1100. You know, it has a beard, so we know it's after about 1000. Almost all the first pictures of Jesus, he's cliche. And then eventually he would have a beard. And that seems to be the norm for Christians today. This is 1300s. Florence.
You punching someone in that, or just like?
Hmm?
You punching someone in the?
Yeah, it's kicking the money changers out of the temple.
Oh.
Remember the whole thing about debt? Now we talk about going back to debt. Yeah, debt. These are the people who are holding others in debt. So, we don't know, we know there's a couple different conflicting stories about this, but where he became famous, where he became known as the Messiah, was called the Sermon of the Mount. He literally appeared when he was about 30 years old into the popular knowledge of people around Jerusalem. And the Sermon of the Mount promised that in this world, as awful as it is, why was it awful? The Romans. There's a kingdom of God if you believe hard and long enough. Now, the Pharisees did not like this. They didn't like a Jew telling them to not believe what they're telling them to do. But this concept that of goodwill and love to all, treat others as you would treat yourself, you can reach this kingdom of God. And this was very much a religion of those who were indebted. This was a religion of the poor. Those who were downtrodden, and he promised to go back to the old Jewish tradition of forgiving debts. Thus the kicking out of the money changers. This is a great painting. This one's in Florence now. Giotto, kind of invented modern art. And in his sermons, he seemed to predict Judgment Day was near. There's actually 4 different stories of this, and will be talked about afterwards. Now, with Judgment Day, it really depended on the point of view of those who read that. Was Judgment Day an actual going to heaven? Or was it Judgment Day for the Romans, and they'll be kicked out? And for that matter, if there's Judgment Day for the Romans, might there be Judgment Day for the Pharisees, who are kind of helping the Romans? Oh, I mentioned that. And the fear was that this might trigger a revolt. Now, this happened before the big revolt in 66, but the reason I mentioned that first is because it showed that the Romans had a legitimate reason to fear revolt. They also were mistreating them, so they shouldn't be surprised. It's a surprise. And so, he would be punished to death in 33 CE by crucifixion. We have pretty good evidence of this. There's one note about Roman crucifixion that mentioning this perhaps that Tiberius was there. But other than that, there's holes. But 33. By the way, you notice we did not say AD. Originally, the thought is that when they made up the modern calendar, about 200 years or about 1400 years later, they guessed on the date of Jesus's, what they thought Jesus might happen, and they're probably about 3 years off, their closest guess. So AD, they kind of bumped him to he was born in 3 BC. But what came out of this was, this is the key element, and this is the most important element of Christianity. This is where it starts. So it starts as a sect of Judaism, and then became something else. The resurrection. How soon after Jesus was crucified did he resurrect?
Well, it depends like which story you read.
Actually, there's two different versions that come in the full gospel. Yeah, usually 2 or 3 days. And he'd be resurrected. And for 50 days. By the way, what holiday is this for Christians?
Easter.
And that is by far the most important holiday for Christians. Christmas would not become important in any way until, once again, thank you, Industrial Revolution. So, we did this last year, and I think I'll do it again. The day before Christmas break, we watched a thing about horrible jobs from Christmas. And it was really good. But they talked about Saturnella, where the Christmas comes from. It's a Roman holiday, basically. We made it to the longest day of the year. We're going to celebrate for 12 days. So, the thought was the day of judgment were near. The apostles were 12 followers of Jesus, who supposedly, those who did not betray him, fled for their life and kept the word of Josiah's teaching alive. They kept it alive. Including the most important, Peter. And supposedly, Peter talked to a traveler by the name of Saul, who we'll get to. Yes, I know, I put down Paul. This is where the faith comes from. But it's going to take about 30 or 40 years before it became really big. And that comes from Paul. Paul was originally Saul. Good name for somebody born in a Jewish household. Saul. He changed it to Paul. Saul. And Paul, right here, took these teachings and spread them. Now, at first he spread them in Israel, and he barely made it with his head. They were going to kill him. And he fled to Greece. And that's how come it became basically a Greek religion. So, we try to make converts, okay, try here was run out, fled to Greece, and try to make converts. And at first, they tried to keep the converts to this new faith within Jewish traditions. And there are a few traditions that have really trouble making converts. Some of you might know some of these traditions that come from the Old Testament. For example, what can't Jews eat? Pork and shellfish. Well, those are very important parts of seafarers' diets here. And so they say, and then pork was kind of a really specialty meat. Someone like, wow, you made it, you had pork? And so they said, well, we won't worry about those two. And a few other things. You can follow, you don't have to do that. A few other practices they did not talk about. Circumcision was one. You don't have to worry about that. And you can convert. He made 3 trips. And once again, appealed to the poor, downtrodden, who were not part of this new Roman world. And changed his name to Paul. And so it very much became a Greek religion. Yeah. And that is where we get this code word for Jesus. The letter Chris, for Christo, which means Christ. Thus X. Xmas. If you ever see that, that just means Christmas. All the X means is Chris. That's all it means. And so that's. And then, because he was a citizen of this Roman Empire, he went to Rome to try to get converts. And he went at the wrong time. Who was emperor when he got there? Nero. And Nero had him beheaded, blamed for the fire. Remember we talked about the fire before? But Christianity spread amongst the poor. Oh, by the way, Peter would be crucified upside down. He went there. But because of the Roman infrastructure and roads and trade, it spread through the poor throughout Rome. It spread all through the empire. Here, that's Jesus. You notice? Clean shape. I don't know why beards. I think because beards became more prominent in medieval Europe a lot thousand, so they figured, okay, you'll be in a beard too. And with citizens at free movement, we already talked about Nero. So Paul, we mentioned him already. So let's get to the catacombs. What are the catacombs?
A really crappy location in guard schools.
Say it again.
A really crappy location in guard schools.
Okay, but I don't know what that is. These are underground cities that basically underground where they keep. There could be stores, it could be the sewers, or for that matter, they're like big cemeteries. If you go to the catacombs of Rome, they're filled with just bones piled up.
Like
Huh?
Paris.
They're Paris, yeah. Yeah, just full of bone. It's pretty weird. If you get a chance, go to the ones, and it smells bad. But other than that, it just smells like underground. But that's where they met. The early churches would be there, and you'd have slaves, or women had a much greater role in these early churches, and they would meet in the catacombs. And they had all these kind of secret symbols of who they are, what they had, and let's get to one of their key symbols. You can see it right there. Oh, and it's very small d democratic. Regular people had a much greater voice of not only who would be the leaders of the church, but also what they would do. Oh, that's going to change. And by the late 200s, by the time of Diocletian, more and more the leaders will be chosen, called bishops, and they will have complete and total charge. By the way, where do bishops live? Wherever there's a cathedral, there's a bishop. And see this symbol, don't write this down. But this would become a code in Greek for Christianity. And using a parable from the Gospels, a fish. And the fish symbol would be a way to, as a code for Christians. And the first letter for Jesus. Second letter, Christ. That's Christmas. God, Son, Savior.
Sick of man.
And here is a shot of Jesus from a catacombs in a church from about 250 BC or 250 AD. And this would be the first symbol of the church, the chi rho, which means to Christ. Here's the Christ, and rho, which is like a P, which essentially means to God. And this would be the symbol. I remember going to some of the older churches in Europe, and that symbol would still be there. Yeah. Oh, sure. And sometimes they kind of turn their back. Sometimes, like Diocletian would have them move. But it was a growing and growing religion. And notice it's shaped like a wheel. Okay. And that's where I want to end. It was a growing religion. After Diocletian died, now wait. After Diocletian died, there's going to be a civil war in Rome. When isn't there? Might there be a vested interest, like somebody vying for power, to maybe appeal to these early Christians looking for an ally? Yes. And thus we're coming to the big shift under Constantine. What's the bell ringing here?
It's like a war, man.
Oh, okay, so we're going to watch this tomorrow, Constantine. And this is the big shift. And it's a great story. Constantine, I don't know if he's a total scoundrel or just a partial scoundrel. I'll have this on. Well, I'll give you the last 5 minutes then. Oh, does everyone have the review list for the test? And there'll be 5 short IDs on this test. And I'm looking at maybe 30 to 35 answers.
That's Wednesday.
And Richard's going to be Wednesday, but I'm moving to Thursday because I forgot about Constantine. So then we'll destroy the empire after that. We will sack Rome.
Oh, you're taking Elon Musk to go sign up? Why didn't you erase him?
I didn't want to. I couldn't buy my eraser. My rag.
They don't have any sack anymore, though. They won't even sack him now.
We're gonna finish the job.
Purple pen. Excited? Constantine, the end of Rome.
So far, it doesn't really have that secret hidden knowledge.
Yeah.
Are we doing like a review day on what's it?
Wednesday after I finish Rome, I'll review and we'll see. The fall of Rome happens shockingly fast. It depends how much I want to talk about the fall. But I will take some time to review, I promise. That book.
Why do you call that Martin?
Because it was made from French. Screw the French. Because coming up from France is. That's nice. Where'd you buy that?
I think I showed you the battle, the generic battle lines between the Persians and Alexander.
That's awesome.
Yeah, it's really well done. There's this thing called, I can't remember the name of the magazine, but I had stuff on Alexander, so I got it. You like my map, everybody?
Very simple.
Is it beautiful?
They just
I
changed
think
the colors of it.
It's very nice.
Can you look at it?
Just the window.
It's really well done.
Yes.
Oh, who made this? That's very good. I like this. It's a hat, but it turns into a trireme. It kind of looks maybe like a hat. All right, shut this off.